It was supposed to be just another normal afternoon. I was in the kitchen, my hands busy with a pot roast I had started earlier in the day. The smell of herbs and roasting meat filled the house, and everything seemed calm, peaceful, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, like a ripple through a pond, something shifted in the air. It wasn't a loud shift, nothing dramatic. No, this was more of a quiet disturbance, subtle but undeniable. I didn't expect much from the day. My grandson Jacob had dropped by after school, as he often did, and we'd made plans to enjoy a simple evening together. He'd helped me set the table, we'd chat, and he'd head back to his parents before it got too late. Nothing special, really. But in that moment when he wandered into the kitchen, everything was different. Jacob, who had always been full of questions and energy, had a quiet intensity about him that day. As I stirred the pot, I noticed he was watching me, his expression unreadable. It was odd, almost as if he were holding something back, something important that he wanted to say, but couldn't find the words for. "Grandma," he said, his voice softer than usual. I looked over at him a little surprised. "What's on your mind, kiddo?" He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and for a brief second I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. That wasn't typical for Jacob. He was usually the confident one, always ready to crack a joke or ask a million questions. But today there was something different about him. He cleared his throat as if to steady himself. "Hiya, Grandma. Can I ask you something?" Now, I've always had an open relationship with Jacob. He's a smart kid, too smart for his own good sometimes. But there was something in the way he said it, the hesitance in his voice, that made me pause. My hands slowed their movements, and I turned to face him fully. "Of course, Jacob, you can ask me anything." He looked down at the floor, and I noticed how tightly his hands were clenched by his sides. The kitchen, usually so full of warmth and comfort, suddenly felt colder, quieter. I felt an unfamiliar tightness in my chest as I waited for him to speak. Then, without looking me in the eye, he asked it. The question that in hindsight I should have seen coming but didn't. "Grandma," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "do you ever wonder if you made the right choices in life?" I froze. I don't think I've ever heard a more unexpected question in my life. My mind raced, trying to process what he meant by it, why he would ask me of all people. I could see him fidgeting, waiting for me to respond, as if the answer he was looking for might just change everything. Well, I began slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Life is full of choices, Jacob. Some good, some bad. But we don't always know what's right in the moment, do we?" Jacob nodded, but I could tell he wasn't satisfied with the answer. The room felt heavier now, the air thick with something unspoken. I had a million thoughts running through my head. Was this about something he had been going through at school? Was it about his parents? Why now? Why me? I set the spoon down on the counter, wiped my hands on the apron, and took a deep breath before I turned to face him fully. "Jacob," I said gently, my voice filled with more sincerity than I'd intended. "Sometimes we don't see the full picture until years later. But it doesn't mean the choices we make are wrong. They just shape us." There was a long pause. I could feel him processing my words, but his silence was heavy. He still wasn't looking at me. His gaze now focused on a spot on the floor just beyond the edge of the kitchen table. I wanted to ask him why he was asking this now, what had led him to ask such a deep question. But instead, I just stood there watching him as he wrestled with his thoughts, waiting for whatever he was holding back to spill out. "Grandma," he said again, his voice low, "do you ever regret things? I mean, do you ever wish you had done something differently?" It was such a personal question, one that I had never really asked myself before. Regrets, of course I had them. But was it something I would share with my grandson? I wasn't sure. But in that moment, something in my heart shifted. Jacob wasn't just asking a simple question. No, he was searching for something he thought he might find in me. In my experiences, in my answer, I walked over to the window and looked outside for a moment, gathering my thoughts. The kitchen felt more intimate now, the silence between us filled with meaning. "I think we all have regrets, Jacob," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But the important thing is to learn from them, to keep moving forward, even when it's hard." I felt his eyes on me, and for the first time in a long while, I felt that he truly saw me, really saw me beyond the surface, beyond the grandmother who baked cookies and told silly stories. This was the beginning of something more than just a question. It was the start of a conversation that would change both of us. The conversation between Jacob and I lingered in the air long after his question had been asked. I could feel the weight of it, the unspoken tension between us. The way his eyes stayed on me, waiting, hoping for something more. I had no idea what he was truly seeking. But in that moment, I knew he needed more than just a passing answer. The room was quieter now, the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound as I moved to the counter to finish preparing dinner. I could feel Jacob standing there, still not speaking, but his presence was heavier, more significant than I had ever noticed before. He was a boy on the verge of manhood, and his questions were no longer about trivial things. They were about real life choices, regrets, and the very essence of who we were as people. I could feel the burden of that moment, and I knew I had to respond more than just with platitudes. He deserved more. "I'll tell you something, Jacob," I said, turning back to him as I carefully plated the potatoes. "When you get to be my age, you'll realize that regrets are just part of the package. But they don't define you. It's what you do with them, what you learn from them that matters." Jacob took a step closer, his curiosity driving him forward. He had always been the type to probe, to want to understand the world in a way that most of his friends didn't. But this wasn't just idle teenage curiosity. This was something deeper, more personal. "So, do you have any regrets, Grandma?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. It was as if he was testing me, gauging whether I was ready to reveal something about myself. I paused for a moment, the question hitting harder than I expected. It wasn't that I had never thought about my regrets before. Of course I had, but I had never shared them with anyone. Not in this way, not with him. It felt like opening a door I hadn't thought to unlock in a long time. "I do, Jacob." I admitted, the words slipping out more easily than I thought. "I've made choices I wish I could take back. But I also know that those choices shaped me. They made me who I am, and I wouldn't trade that for anything." He watched me closely, his eyes searching as though trying to understand the complexity of what I was saying. I could tell that the answer I had given him wasn't enough. He wasn't satisfied with simple truths. He wanted to understand my soul, the parts of me that I kept hidden even from myself. "What kind of choices?" he asked, the question hanging between us. There was no judgment in his voice, just a quiet, genuine curiosity. I hesitated. The kitchen was filled with the smell of food, but all I could focus on was Jacob's face, his earnestness, his desire to understand. I knew that I couldn't keep hiding the truths I had kept locked away for so long. Maybe this was the moment to share them, to open up in a way I never had before. I took a deep breath, looking out the window as I tried to gather my thoughts. The evening light was starting to fade, casting a warm glow on the kitchen. It felt like the perfect time to talk, to connect in a way that we hadn't before. I began. There was a time when I felt like I had to follow certain expectations, what people thought I should do, who I should be. I married your grandfather when I was young, and we had a family, a life that was good. But there were times when I wondered if I was living my life for me, or for everyone else. Jacob was quiet, but I could tell that he was listening intently, hanging on to every word. Somewhere along the way, I lost parts of myself. I continued. I became a wife, a mother, a grandmother, but I didn't always take the time to be Sophia, the person I was before all of that. And there were times when I wished I had been braver, when I wished I had taken risks or pursued things I cared about more than pleasing others. I could feel the lump in my throat, the vulnerability of sharing this with him, but it felt right, like something had shifted between us, and this moment, this conversation, was a step towards something deeper. Jacob was silent for a long while. The only sound was the soft sizzle of the roast in the oven, the ticking of the clock on the wall. I could feel the tension building again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared understanding, an unspoken connection. "You've always been brave, Grandma," Jacob said suddenly, his voice soft but steady. "I've always thought that. You've been through a lot and you always keep going. Maybe you didn't take those risks, but you've done what matters." I looked at him, my heart swelling with pride. His words meant more to me than he could possibly know. He was starting to understand not just the surface of things, but the deeper layers of life, the complexity of choices, of regrets, and of learning to accept the paths we take. I smiled, feeling a warmth fill my chest. "Thank you, Jacob. That means a lot." The room was quiet again, but this time it was a peaceful silence, the kind that comes after a moment of real connection. I could see him thinking, processing everything I had shared. And I knew that he was beginning to understand the delicate balance of life, of choices, and of the wisdom that comes with age. The meal was almost ready, and I could feel the evening winding down. But this conversation, this moment was far from over. Jacob had asked questions I hadn't expected, and in return I had shared pieces of myself that I hadn't known I was ready to give. But in that kitchen, with the soft glow of the evening light and the sound of our voices together, I realized something important. Maybe this was the most important part of life, the moments we spend learning from each other, the quiet conversations that reveal who we really are, and the way we grow together, even when we don't expect it. The night had fallen quietly by the time we sat down to eat. The light from the kitchen now seemed to wrap around us like a warm blanket, casting soft shadows on the walls. Jacob and I were no longer just the grandmother and grandson who passed the time with lighthearted jokes. No, something had changed. We were more than that now. We were two people who had shared something real, something deep. The air was different between us, charged with a quiet understanding that neither of us fully understood, but we both felt as we ate. The conversation didn't return to what had just happened, but there was a certain ease between us now. Jacob didn't feel like the boy who came to visit his grandmother anymore. He felt like someone who had seen a glimpse of the complexities of life and was trying to figure out where he fit in. And me, I felt a bit lighter, as if the weight I had been carrying for so long was beginning to ease just a little. The night stretched on, and eventually the meal came to an end. We sat back in our chairs, comfortable in the silence that had fallen over us. I could tell Jacob was still processing everything that had been said. He looked thoughtful, his gaze distant, as if he was turning over the words I had shared with him. "Grandma," he said quietly, breaking the silence, "do you ever wish you had done things differently?" I looked at him, surprised by the question, though it was one I had expected to hear. "I think everyone has those thoughts at some point," I said, my voice steady. "But I also believe that every choice leads you to where you are. And where I am, well, I'm okay with it. I've learned a lot and there's still more to learn." Jacob nodded, but I could tell he wasn't fully satisfied with that answer. He wasn't asking for a lesson. He was asking for something deeper, something that would make sense of it all. Something that would show him how to navigate the path he was on. "Do you think I'll figure it out?" he asked, his voice almost pleading. The whole life thing. There was a rawness in his question that made me stop and think. It wasn't just a passing curiosity. It was a plea for understanding, for reassurance. I put my hand on the table, my fingers brushing the edge of my plate. "You'll figure it out, Jacob. But it won't be easy. No one has it all figured out. Not really. And that's okay. The important thing is to keep searching, to keep asking questions, and to keep being open to whatever life brings your way." He looked at me for a long moment, studying my face as if trying to see if I really believed the words I was saying. "I guess that's kind of comforting," he said finally, a small smile tugging at his lips. I smiled back, my heart swelling with a strange mix of pride and relief. "You're going to be just fine, kiddo." And in that moment I realized something. Despite the regrets and the what-ifs that had clouded my own journey, I had the privilege of guiding him, of offering him something I didn't have when I was his age. I could offer him perspective, honesty, and the kind of love that transcended all the complications of life. Jacob stood up from the table, pushing his chair back with a soft scrape. "Thanks, Grandma," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "I needed to hear that." I nodded, my throat suddenly tight. "Anytime, Jacob." He turned to leave, but then paused at the door. He looked back at me, his eyes softening, and I could see the young man he was becoming in that brief glance. "I'm glad I came over tonight," he said simply, before walking out the door. I stood there for a moment, my hands pressed against the counter, watching the door swing softly behind him. It was a quiet goodbye, but one that felt more significant than any words could express. As I cleaned up the kitchen and went about the usual evening routine, I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened. The conversation, the questions, the answers, they had all woven together into something bigger than just a chat between grandmother and grandson. It had been a moment of connection, of sharing pieces of ourselves in a way that we had never done before. I didn't know if Jacob would remember this conversation the way I would. I didn't know if it would have the same impact on him as it did on me. But what I did know deep in my heart was that in that quiet kitchen we had both grown together and separately. We had touched on something profound, something that would shape us both in ways we couldn't yet understand. As I finished cleaning up the last of the dishes, I felt a calmness settle over me. Maybe, just maybe, the choices I had made in my life weren't as far off course as I had once thought. Perhaps the lessons I had learned, the regrets I carried had all led me to this moment. A moment where I could share the wisdom of my years with someone I loved deeply. And in doing so, I realized that sometimes the answers don't lie in perfect choices or flawless paths. Sometimes the answers are found in the conversations we have, in the simple moments of understanding and connection.